Welcome to the DX Today podcast, your weekly deep dive into the AI ecosystem. I'm Rick Spair, and joining me as always is Laura. Today we are talking about a deadline that arrives on this exact calendar day, and almost nobody outside of compliance departments is ready for it.
I have been waiting all week for this one, Rick, because something genuinely strange happened today. Europe just hit one of the most consequential dates in the entire artificial intelligence rulebook, and the headline that everyone expected turned out to be completely wrong.
Let's set the table for people who do not live inside regulatory tracker spreadsheets. What specifically is happening on August 2nd of 2026, and why has this particular date been circled on calendars for well over a year?
The European Union's Artificial Intelligence Act entered into force in 2024 with a deliberately staggered schedule, and today was always a major milestone. What became applicable this morning is Article 50, which is the transparency chapter of the entire law.
Here's where I have to push back, because my understanding for the past year was that today would be the day the high-risk regime landed. Hiring algorithms, credit scoring, education systems, border control tools. What happened to all of that?
That is the plot twist. The European Union passed something called the Digital Omnibus, a simplification package, and it moved the standalone high-risk deadline from today out to December 2nd of 2027. That is roughly 16 additional months of breathing room.
16 months on what was supposed to be the centerpiece of the entire law. Walk me through how that actually got done procedurally, because moving a deadline inside a regulation this size is not a small legislative maneuver.
It moved fast for Brussels. Political agreement on May 7th, the European Parliament approved the simplification measures on June 11th, and the Council gave its final green light on June 29th. There is also a second deferral tucked inside that package.
Tell me about the second one, because I suspect that is the piece manufacturers and medical device companies have been very quietly, very intensely interested in for the last several months.
You guessed right. High-risk artificial intelligence embedded inside already regulated products. Things like industrial machinery, robotics, and medical devices moves out to August 2nd of 2028. That is the Annex I category, as distinct from the standalone Annex III systems.
I want to be the skeptic here for a moment. Is this genuine implementation reality, or is this deregulation dressed up as a scheduling adjustment? Because from the outside, those two things can look absolutely identical.
Fair challenge, and the honest answer is that the stated reason is unusually mundane. Member states had not finished designating their national competent authorities, and the harmonized technical standards companies would need to conform to were not finished either. The regulator had not finished building the ruler.
Which is awkward, but I suppose more honest than, pretending the infrastructure existed all along. And still, 16 months is a very long time in this industry. How should companies actually read that gap?
The framing I think is most accurate is reprieve rather than repeal. Conformity assessments, technical documentation, human oversight controls, database registration, all of it is still coming. Companies that treat 16 extra months as cancellation instead of runway will face identical obligations later with far less time.
Runway, not cancellation. That is worth sitting on. Now let's get to what actually did take effect today, because I think this is the part that has been badly underreported nearly everywhere I have looked this week.
Article 50 is not one rule, and that is the single most important thing to understand. It is 5 distinct duties, attaching to different parties with different exceptions. That structure is precisely why so many organizations are getting this wrong right now.
Start with the one everyone has heard about, the chatbot disclosure, and the basic idea that if I am talking to a machine, the machine is obligated to tell me that it is in fact a machine.
That is duty 1, and it lands on providers. If you build a system that interacts directly with people, you must design it so the person is informed they are dealing with artificial intelligence. But there is a carve-out, and it is slippery.
Let me guess at the shape of that carve-out, and you tell me how close I get. It runs something like, you do not have to say it when it is already screamingly obvious to anyone paying attention.
Almost word for word. The standard is that disclosure is not required where the fact is obvious to a reasonably well-informed, observant, and circumspect person in the circumstances, which is a lovely phrase doing an enormous amount of undefined work.
Let's move to the second duty, because I think this one has the most technical teeth in the entire chapter. Provider-side content marking. What does the law actually require there in practice?
Providers of systems that generate or manipulate synthetic audio, image, video, or text must ensure outputs are marked in a machine-readable format and detectable as artificially generated. This is not a visible watermark requirement. It is a signal requirement underneath the content itself.
But there's a qualifier sitting right there in the text. To the extent technically feasible, whenever I see a phrase like that in a statute, my first thought is that a very well-paid lawyer is going to drive a truck straight through it.
I hear you, but I will defend that language. Watermark survival is a genuinely unsolved engineering problem. You can mark an image perfectly, and then somebody screenshots it, re-encodes it, crops it, and runs it through 3 platforms that strip metadata by default.
All right, duty 3, this is the deepfake provision, and I have a feeling this is where the carve-outs get genuinely contentious given everything happening across media and politics right now.
Deepfake disclosure lands on deployers rather than providers, which matters. If you use artificial intelligence to generate or manipulate image, audio, or video constituting a deepfake, you must disclose it. But artistic, creative, satirical, and fictional works receive tailored treatment.
And there is the satire question again, which we have now seen surface in several jurisdictions. My concern is that satire is the easiest possible label to claim and one of the hardest things for any regulator to adjudicate after the fact.
Agreed, but I want to be precise about what tailored treatment means. Because people misread it constantly, it is not a blanket exemption from disclosure. It is a modified manner of disclosure designed not to destroy the experience of the creative work itself.
That is a meaningful distinction, and I am glad you drew it. So the satirist still discloses they simply do not have to plaster a compliance banner across the middle of the frame.
Exactly. Duty 4 covers emotion recognition and biometric categorization systems, where deployers must inform the people being exposed to them. That one is quietly significant, because emotion recognition runs in retail analytics, hiring interviews, and call centers where almost nobody knows it exists.
Which explains why it sits in the transparency chapter rather than waiting for the high-risk regime. That leaves duty 5, and I understand this is the one that had newsrooms genuinely panicking for a while.
If you publish artificial intelligence-generated or manipulated text, to inform the public on matters of public interest, you generally must disclose it. On first read, that sounded like every publisher using drafting assistance was suddenly inside the scope of a European statute.
And I take it the fine print changed that picture substantially, because otherwise we would be hearing considerably more screaming from the publishing industry than we currently are hearing.
There is an exemption for content that has undergone human review or editorial control, where a person or entity holds editorial responsibility for publication. So if a real human being is accountable for what gets published, you are not automatically swept in.
Now let's talk about a date I think will trip a lot of people up, and which is December 2nd of 2026. There is a transition period here that I have already seen described incorrectly in 3 separate places this week.
This one is narrow and people keep inflating it. Providers of systems covered by Article 50, Paragraph 2, placed on the market before today, have until December 2nd of 2026 to implement technical marking solutions. That is the entire scope of it.
Let's talk about the money, because that focuses executive attention considerably faster than any amount of principled argument about transparency. What is the actual exposure for getting Article 50 wrong?
Article 50 violations sit in a penalty tier of up to 15 million euros, or 3% of total worldwide annual turnover for the preceding financial year, whichever is higher. For qualifying small and medium enterprises, including startups, it flips to whichever is lower.
I appreciate that they built the small business inversion into the statute rather than leaving it to enforcement discretion. But here is the harder question. Is there actually anybody staffed and empowered to bring one of these cases today?
And there is the irony of this entire episode, Rick. The high-risk regime was delayed partly because national competent authorities have not been fully designated. Those are, in many cases, the very same authorities who would enforce the transparency rules that went live this morning.
Let's address what listeners in the United States are asking right now, which is whether any of this touches them at all if they have no European entity and no European office anywhere?
It absolutely can, and this is where people get complacent. The Act reaches providers placing systems on the union market regardless of where they are established, and it reaches providers and deployers outside the union where the output produced by the system is used inside it.
So the exercise is going through each system, determining whether you are the provider or the deployer for that specific thing, and connecting that role to a real jurisdictional connection rather than assuming either coverage or immunity.
Exactly. And organizations are often both for different systems. So what they need is a map rather than a memo. There is also a voluntary instrument sitting alongside all of this that people misunderstand badly.
This is the code of practice. I am not certain most people understand what signing it does or does not by them, so tell me where that actually stands right now.
On July 8th, the Commission concluded that the Code of Practice on Artificial Intelligence generated content adequately covers the obligations under Article 50, paragraphs 2, 4, and 5, and the AI Board adopted its adequacy assessment the following day.
So if I sign that code, am I safe? Is that functionally a compliance shield, or is it something considerably softer than the word adequacy might suggest to a casual reader?
Considerably softer. Adherence can help demonstrate compliance, but it is explicitly not conclusive evidence, and the code does not address every Article 50 issue. What it buys you is predictability, a defined path rather than a bespoke approach you must defend from scratch.
Before we wrap, I want to widen the lens because I have been reading about this deadline for weeks, and I only just learned that Europe was not the only jurisdiction with something taking effect on this exact date.
California Senate Bill 942 became operative today as well. It requires generative by generative artificial intelligence providers with more than 1 million California monthly users to embed provenance data in images, video, and audio, and to offer a free public detection tool.
That is a remarkable coincidence of timing, and I have to imagine it is not entirely coincidental given how closely these regimes watch one another. What technical standard is California actually pointing at here?
It is built around C2, PA-compatible provenance, the same content credential standard the industry has been converging on for years. California also requires that users be able to add a visible artificial intelligence label, which Europe does not mandate in quite the same way.
So two of the largest regulatory markets on Earth now require machine-readable provenance on synthetic content landing on the same calendar day, pointing at broadly compatible technical standards. That is how a de facto global standard actually gets born.
That is the real story underneath the story, and it matters more than either individual statute does alone. When Brussels and Sacramento independently converge on the same plumbing, that plumbing stops being optional for anyone operating at any real scale.
Let me play devil's advocate one final time before we wrap, because the hardest question here is empirical rather than legal. Does any of this labeling actually change what people believe when they encounter synthetic content?
The behavioral evidence on human-facing labels is genuinely mixed, and I will not overclaim it. Some studies show labels reduce belief in false content. Others show a troubling implied truth effect where unlabeled falsehoods end up trusted more than they deserve.
Which is a real problem, because if labeling some content makes people more credulous about everything else, you could arguably be making the overall information environment worse rather than better.
You could, and that is exactly why the machine-readable requirement is the more important half of Article 50. Human labels are a user interface question, but machine-readable provenance is infrastructure that platforms, search engines, and downstream systems can act on automatically.
So what should people be watching from here? Give me the dates that actually matter now that today has come and gone without the headline everybody was expecting to write.
3 of them, December 2nd of 2026 for the legacy marking transition and the new prohibited practices. December 2nd of 2027 for the standalone high-risk regime. And August 2nd of 2028 for artificial intelligence embedded in regulated products.
And underneath all 3 sits the harmonized standards work, which is the unglamorous thing that quietly determines whether any of those deadlines are actually achievable when they eventually arrive on the calendar.
That is the one I would watch most closely. Deadlines get moved when standards are not ready. If the standards work finishes on schedule, December of 2027 holds. If it slips again, we have all now seen exactly how that movie ends.
That is a fittingly unglamorous place to land, which is usually a sign we reached something true. The headline was a delay. The reality is that a real obligation went live today, and the hard part is still ahead of everyone.
And my closing thought is simply this. Anybody who read the delay headline and closed the tab is going to spend the next few months discovering that 5 separate transparency duties attached to their products this morning while they were not paying attention.
That's all for today's episode of the DX Today podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.